there's a really fun origin story here, and you know I love a fun origin story. So I found out about this conference that a friend was hosting in upstate New York called Like Minds. And I'm like, this is kind of neat. You know, it's at a summer camp. I don't really know who's going to be there. And so I showed up, and we're staying in like summer camp cabins, but it's like packed with adults who ostensibly like do things that are professionally related to one another. And who was my bunkmate but Nick? And so Nick and I got to talking about time, which will become relevant as he gets into his talk. And I was like, what does this guy do? Like, who is this guy? And then he walked up on stage, and he told me a little bit about the Long Now Foundation. The Long Now Foundation is a foundation that he'll tell you about that is here in the interval. So the space that we're in is really a part of their vision and orienting us towards long-term thinking, which is something that is very much a core value of Baukunst. So I'm excited to bring Nick up to share a little bit about their work and to really ignite us in this specific place that we're in today and that we'll be sharing tomorrow. So Nick, I invite you to the stage.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you to the whole Baukunst group and all of you for being here. This is really exciting. I'm really happy to see this space being activated like this after not being able to do this for so many months with the pandemic and such. So thank you for being here. Thank you for coming out. My name is Nick Brysiewicz. I'm the Director of Strategy here at the Long Now Foundation. I've been here for about 7 years now. And I want to tell you a little bit about the space that you're in and about the work that we do at the foundation before I dive into a conversation with Tyler about creative technology at the timescale of civilization. Let's see if this works. All right, that's the sign you passed under when you came in here today. This is the interval. The interval is one of the projects, one of the many projects of the Long Now Foundation, which was founded, Long Now was, in 1996. In 1996, you can imagine that if you were a creative technologist in the late 90s, the year 2000 was where all of the cognitive energy was for the future, right? You know, the year 2001, Space Odyssey. 2000 was when it was all going to happen. And in 96, it was close enough for you to know you were about to blow past that milestone. And where were you going to place that cognitive energy in the future after that? Danny Hillis, a guy at MIT who invented massive parallel computing and worked on some of the fastest computers in the world, started thinking we kind of need an enduring symbol for the future, the same way the pyramids of Giza are an enduring symbol of the past. And what would an enduring symbol of the future even be like, you know? And he started thinking that maybe it was really a clock. Could you imagine a monument-scale clock, like the pyramids, that would keep good time for the next 10,000 years? 10,000 years because 10,000 years ago, we came out of an ice age, and we started planting things in the ground and building cities and doing generally what we refer to as civilization. So if you want to think at the scale of civilization, you'd want to think ahead about as far as you'd want to think back. So that 10,000-year period on both sides of this present moment is what we call the long now, as opposed to the short now of this wonderful conference in these next 2 days, the long now of civilization itself. And this is actually a photo of that clock project. The clock is now being constructed in Texas. It'll probably be open in my lifetime, but we don't have a date. And they've been working on it since '96. They've been designing it. We broke ground in Texas somewhere around 2010. Actually, the bar top here is made from some of the steps that were carved out of the mountain in Texas. Yeah. So there's that. So the clock project was really our origin project. That was what kicked everything off. The foundation started growing around it, and all of a sudden, other people were attracted to this project and wanted to talk about, oh, I have this thought about the next 10,000 years, or I've got this project that's going to affect the next 100 years. And so we started having talks where we'd invite an expert, a Nobel laureate, a best-selling author, to talk about their work in the context of the next and last 10,000 years. And soon enough, there was a membership program. Next thing you know, we had additional projects. Under the staircase, you'll see something called a Rosetta disk, where we've archived, pretty much all of human language, dictionaries, grammars, vocabulary lists, parallel text translations of Genesis and the United Declaration of Human Rights, all micro-etched onto a nickel disk about that big, one of which we landed on a comet, the rubber ducky-shaped comet that was in the news a few years ago, 67P, one of which we landed on the surface of the moon, possibly too fast. I'll leave it to you to decide what state that one's in. And about 100 of those are here on the surface of the planet, hidden in places, as a way of creating a long-term archive to preserve some of our humanity, some of the language and the poetry that matters to us. And so we have that project. You probably heard about the de-extinction of the woolly mammoth. Our Revive and Restore project had a hand in that. We have a long-term betting platform called Long Bets. If you think something's going to happen in the next 100 years and one of your friends thinks it isn't, you should make a long bet. We got to write a $2 million check to Warren Buffett a couple of years ago because he bet a hedge fund, a fund of funds, that the S&P 500 would beat them on a 10-year time period, which of course the other guy had to take that bet, but they got spanked, and Warren Buffett got $2 more millions. So we've got that project, and of course, there's a couple, there's a seminar series. We've got talks that we do here at the interval. And this is kind of one of those ideas that I love, because sometimes the clock, you tell people about you're building a 10,000-year clock, and that really opens up their mind. They start thinking about the future in a different way. Some people, the Woolly Mammoth Project or the Rosetta Disk, this really makes them come alive. And some people you need to ply with a couple of drinks. You just need to pull them out of whatever short-term thinking system they've cornered themselves into, and you need to sit them down over a really nice cocktail and really ask them, what do you think we need to do if we want to be good ancestors to the next 400 generations of human beings? So that brings us right back to here and thinking about the kinds of conversations that are important to have. And I'm so glad that you guys are having this conversation about creative technology here in this space. The Long Now Foundation turned 25 recently, and we're looking at our next 25 years, what we're calling our second quarter, our Q2. And we're thinking about what the world needs from a Long Now Foundation in the next 25 years, because we're thinking it's probably a little different from what the world needed from Long Now in the last 25 years. And so we're also trying to gather people in this space to have conversations about what you think needs to be done to get people to think long term, or on what time scale should we plan and how should our projects be oriented so that we can be good ancestors. And so we're thinking about how to find all those people, connect people all around the globe. Our hope is that in the next 25 years, we can be an anchor institution at the center of a field, a global field of long-term thinking with little hubs all over the planet. So it's not just a Bay Area organization, which we've been up until this point, but it's truly a global thing. So that's a little bit about the Long Now Foundation. I'll be around having cocktails later tonight if you have any other questions. We've got a lot of other things. The back wall is kind of abstruse unless somebody walks you through some of these things, but I'm happy to point at any of these things and tell you what they're all about. Happy to give tours of what's underneath the staircase, and yeah, if you have any other questions, happy to talk about it. But I think right now, I'd really like to jump into a conversation with Tyler.
Thanks, Nick. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being such great hosts here, too. We feel right at home. It's really
my pleasure. I really got to give a shout out to the team around the interval. They're really fantastic for putting this together. So thank you, everybody, so much.
So one of the kind of main topics of conversation and kind of the threads that's been running through the whole event so far, it's just been talking about this term creative technologist and what it means to people, because it's a pretty broad term and I think can be interpreted very differently, and part of what we're trying to define by illustration is who the people are and kind of what motivates them. So I'm just kind of curious what that term means to you, and especially relative to the long-term thinking work you're doing with the foundation.
Yeah, thanks. It's such an interesting term. I think it's the right term, but unpacking it's kind of fun. I was sitting on a flight back here from Europe a couple of days ago thinking about what the term means to me and how do I slice that up conceptually. And the first thing that I thought about was that it might be really interesting for us to think about what an uncreative technology would be, right? What does it mean for a technology to be uncreative? Some of you might know about the book Finite and Infinite Games, right? James Carse. And this idea that, there's two categories of games that human beings play. One is finite games, which you play for the purpose of winning the game. And the other category is infinite games, which you play for the purpose of playing more games. You just want to expand the surface area of the games that you're playing. And so I think about creative technologies as technologies that are creating more opportunities for creating more opportunities. To what extent does the technology that you're bringing into the world actually open up more spaces and more possibilities for the future, versus you can imagine there's technologies that are reducing that space of creativity. I think if you're working on technologies where people are popping red bubbles on their phone to feed their family, that might not be the most creative of technologies, but you can think of a lot of technologies that open up spaces that weren't accessible before. So that's one of the things that I think about when I think about creative technologies, focusing on the creative bit. But the other thing that's really interesting for me is thinking about the technology bit, which what does it mean to be creative in the medium of technology? Right? Like people sculpt things in clay or they make physical objects. What does it mean to be creative in this medium of technology, to be a creative person who just, you don't use paint, maybe you don't use music, maybe you make technological products or things that people are going to use in that way. So I think about those two kinds of things. How are you thinking about it? I also wasn't here for this morning's session, so maybe you guys tackled this a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think a big thing, one of the things we've kind of been hitting on is thinking about technology very broadly as well. And I see some of that like reflected in the different types of projects that the foundation goes about doing too, is really understanding the normal things we think about, like the gears and the cranks and the software, but also the human systems as well too. I think there's a lot in the social constructs we have that share knowledge and pass knowledge down and are effectively levers for force over time too. And I think we've been hitting on a lot of those things, just talking about interpersonal connections and how we go about doing our work and how we feel about our work. And I think those are all those social constructs are technologies as well too.
Yeah.
And I think along those lines, like I'm really curious. Like it seems like you're at a little a kind of a special moment in time for the foundation as well, where you're turning your vision towards Q2, like you talked about, and really kind of coming to a point of feeling like there's a sturdy foundation that you're starting to scale and to cross-pollinate in different parts of the world. And a big part of that, I imagine, is growing cross-generational as well, and like reaching out and building bridges between younger generations and older generations as you move geographically across the world as well. And kind of curious about how you facilitate some of that, or how you think about fostering that knowledge transfer between generations.
Yeah, the knowledge transfer, right? That's kind of the thread of continuity in so many different organizations, including ours. A couple years ago, we started a project called the Organizational Continuity Project, which is a research endeavor trying to collect information empirically on organizations that have lasted for like 900 years, right? It's absolutely wild how many of them there are. I mean, there's not an infinite number of them, but there's more than you might think. There's breweries, brasseries, hotels, distilleries, hot springs in Japan, all kinds of things like this. And you can go to Wikipedia and see these pages, but we're really kind of combing through the existing literature, having people, researchers on the ground, go into these places and figure out, how did you guys make it through the last pandemic? Because if you've been around for 1,000 years or a couple thousand years, like you've done this before. So what do we know? What do we know that we don't know we know that's out there? We're kind of trying to cull and collect that so that people can learn about what's happened in the past, right? Now that we might have different normative ideas for how we should go about this in the future. I think one of the issues with a lot of these long-lived institutions is, in a modern time, you get people, maybe they're passed down through families, and you get somebody who doesn't want to be in the same business as their parents. I mean, I can relate to that. I didn't want to be in the same business as my parents. They were not 10,000-year cultural foundation administrators. So this is different. Actually, I've always wanted to do an event here where the staff of Long Now calls their parents on Zoom and asks them to explain to the audience what they think their kids do. That would be, right? Anyways, that was a bit of an aside. But so like generational transition, like what actually makes it through the generational filter? And how do we do that? I think at Long Now, we're trying to pull people together in spaces like this or over cocktails where people can share stories about, the last big tech wave felt like this and looked like this, and we learned some things. So there's a lot of, conveyance of information across time that we cultivate here and at the seminar series. But we're also trying to do this more broadly and globally and seeing what do people think in other parts of the world and how are they translating that knowledge through time.
Yeah, and I think some of the projects I've heard you talk about, like when you study some of those organizations, it's things like religious institutions, like even like the Catholic Church, or it's like rebuilding of Japanese temples on a regular cadence, where
universities.
Universities, and a lot of that kind of touches on process knowledge. That's really an understanding that's kind of learned and passed down by doing things together. It's not just things that can be written in a book. It's like there's actually kind of some limitations around what can be transferred just in a purely like written like knowledge format that way. And it's really about doing things together as well. And I really appreciate that about the clock project and some of the other things too. They're really groups of people coming together to do something, not just to talk or not just to write something down in a book too. And I think really like remembering that not all knowledge can be transferred in books, but needs to be transferred by doing things together is so important.
And some of it needs to be discovered by just pushing yourself up against a question that no one else has pushed themselves up against as diligently as you're about to. I mean, building a 10,000-year clock, you're all of a sudden thinking about joints, metal joints and stuff in a way that no one's really had to or bothered to. So you're putting some really bright people into a space of questioning where they might be the first person to ever really sit with that kind of a question in that space with that expertise. And from that, you derive some really cool insights that you can then share with somebody so that they don't have to be the first to do it again.
Totally. Slightly more difficult question. I'm curious, like, how you field some of the criticism that must exist around long-term thinking. Like, there's so many kind of urgent problems that we face day to day on, in our day-to-day lives that like sometimes like amongst like limited time and resources, it's sometimes hard to strike a balance or to even be an advocate for dedicating some of those resources to long-term thinking when there's such urgent problems. And I think there's some of the same conversations that come up around space exploration or human longevity, et cetera, too, that I think kind of touch on some of the same things you guys think about. But kind of curious like how you like respond or like talk about at least your internal processes of like justifying what you should work on and the opportunity cost with that.
Yeah, I think this is a challenge that's shared by all our arts organizations, right? Doing art is always a bad idea. It is always something else you could be doing. There's never been a good time in history to put together an orchestra. There's always other resource needs elsewhere. And so whenever you're advocating for something in the arts, especially grander things like putting together an orchestra or building a 10,000-year clock, you're in this space where there's the argument of, like how could that money be applied other ways and who gets to say? You get into conversations about governance, politics, and preferences. Another way of looking at it is that the budget for Shrek 2 is $150 million. And so we already do make a lot of cultural decisions about how we invest our capital. And you could call some of the extant decisions into question. Not to cast aspersions on anybody who might have worked with the Shrek 2 team.
It's no Shrek 1.
It's just... The Shrek 1 budget was a lot more modest. It's not the one I can give as an example. There was a lot of cost inflation between Shrek 1 and Shrek 2. That's why it's my go-to example. So when you think about something like the clock, you're looking at a project that's on the scale of like a rom-com, right? And yet this project has touched people across 26 years so far. It's going to touch people ideally for another 400 generations. So, you can get into this, but you're fundamentally getting in a space where you're advocating for something that's kind of... It's almost like the justification takes away something from it. At some point, you're kind of arguing for a kind of dignity that really, like once you start arguing for it or accounting for it in a spreadsheet, you've kind of lost the thread a little bit. So there's also something about just finding the people that are touched by the work that you're working on and then just drawing them close and kind of continuing to do the important work that calls out to you. Because there's a good chance that the stuff, if it really calls to you in a way that you can't not do it, there's a good chance you might be the only person that's hearing that call, and you got to kind of chase it. I think that's my personal take.
Absolutely. I mean, I believe that like we can't just work on short-term problems. We have to in parallel work on short-term and long-term problems because some things just take a long time to develop, and if we don't proactively work on them, it's going to be too late once we get there. And I appreciate a lot of the work you guys do on shining a light on some of those interesting things, the long-term problems that we could be working on. And I almost find like as short-term problems escalate, the now becomes so noisy that like we like need almost more voices pointing to longer-term problems. Just as a reminder, and ultimately the healthy thing is like that we talk about all those things too, and like the discussion around like should we work on the long thing or the short thing, like that's actually like the real like meat of the interaction and this conversation. Yeah,
this gets into another thing that I'll just say really quick, which is one of the reasons why the long-term thing on a 10,000-year time scale thing matters so deeply to me is that it's a range that we're not really well attuned to. So you could argue that, I don't think long-term thinking is in opposition to short-term thinking. I think you need to have short-term thinking. We've all evolved because we can track things that move at the speed of jaguars. Can you guys still hear me? Yeah? Cool. We can track things that move at the speed of like jaguars, right? We're pretty good at this. The ones that weren't good at this aren't really here anymore. But like we don't really function at the speed of like antibiotic resistance or climate change, right? These things are a little bit slower to manifest, and they only really become salient when you do take a longer perspective, when you zoom out a little bit. So there's a sense in which it's actually a distribution of time attunements that's really important to have. And so all we're doing is advocating for this one particular, very specific time attunement to the scale of civilization. That's really important because the works that we're doing, the technological projects we're engaged in, generally have impacts on these timescales. So it's really important for us to be able to develop an awareness or an intuition on these timescales, a sense for what happens at the timescale of 10,000 years versus 100 years or 10 years or 25 years or the next hour. So it's also about just increasing our range. So, it's kind of an aesthetic metaphor I'm using of like, you can imagine a palette that just adds some more colors that are the long-term colors, or you can imagine a keyboard, a piano, and you just have more low range now. You can reach things that you couldn't reach before because somebody was out there working on those things. So there's also that. It's not that these things exist in competition for these other things, but there's a non-zero sum thing here where we're all kind of helping each other out. The short-term things are supported by long-term thinking. Long-term thinking, I mean, we're here in San Francisco. Long-term thinking is extraordinarily supported by short-term thinking. So these things go together more than they're opposed.
That's awesome. Just kind of curious for people that are here that are maybe either have known about the Long Now Foundation for a long time or are just learning about it, what are some opportunities to get actively involved with the organization?
Yeah, so I think if you're living in San Francisco, you've got to come to a seminar. You've got to come hang out at the interval and have a drink. I'm usually here Friday evenings, and there's usually like 30 to 60 people who filter through and just say hi to their friends. So there's definitely, that's like something you should definitely consider. And then we have a membership program. That membership program is a global membership program. We've got 12,000 people now across like 65 countries. Some of them are kicking in like $8 a month, so it's less than Netflix. Yeah, that's a great way to plug in. And then, I think we're a pretty accessible foundation as well. So if you've got ideas or things that you find in your peregrinations around the creative technology space and something really cool strikes your eye that maybe, it exists. One of my favorite things is receiving emails from people like, did you see this other 10,000 year thing? And the answer is usually like, no, probably not. I was busy staring at this 10,000 year thing for a while. And so we just also love hearing about things that are happening out there in the world, because you might think that like, an alarm bell goes off here every single time somebody works on a 10,000 year timescale thing, but that's not true. You're all my distributed alarm bell. So please just also feel welcome to shoot me an email. I'm nick@longnow.org, and I would love to hear from anybody who's got cool ideas about things that are happening out.
And there's so many amazing collaborators kind of like circling around the foundation too. Like, I don't know if you've noticed like the piece of art on the wall Brian Eno did that's like the slowly evolving light installation behind the bar. Like that's amazing.
Long Now is also Brian's coinage.
Oof.
It's the analog to the big here, right? And Brian realized he had a friend who had a really nice apartment in a really dodgy neighborhood, and he asked her, how do you like living here? And she's like, oh, it's amazing. It's the best place. He's like, yeah, but like, how do you live here, like the big here? And it's like a different context for thinking about that. And Long Now is kind of the temporal analog to that spatial concept. So
I like that. Like, if you're a sci-fi fan, Neil Stephenson's book Anthem, if you read that, like also partially inspired by the 10,000 Year Clock, and he's like a collaborator on thinking about the project as well.
Yeah, he's been involved with the Clock Project since the earliest of days. We just had him come give a talk about his new book Termination Shock in November. Kevin Kelly, who started a magazine called Wired, is still involved. He's our board co-chair. You got Peter Schwartz, who was one of the futurists who came up with the idea of scenario planning. If you like the way Minority Report looks, I think he's partially to blame for that. That's kind of a vision for the future. And
OG Stuart Brand.
Of course, yeah, Stuart Brand. Stuart Brand's also my next door neighbor on the houseboats in Sausalito. But Stuart, the guy who started the Whole Earth Catalog and the Global Business Network and about like 18 other things that have absolutely touched your life. Stuart's got a documentary that's going to be streaming in August. You should keep an eye out for that one. It's really fantastic. It's called We Are as Gods, and his biography by John Markoff from the New York Times just came out a couple weeks ago. We had an event at the SF Jazz to launch it, but it's a fantastic biography. I learned like 90% of the stuff in that book was news to me. And then of course, Danny Hillis I'd mentioned from MIT, who is also the kind of the conceptual genius that came up with the idea of the clock. Yeah, and there's more. There's more. I could do this
amazing.
for a long time.
Yeah.
We'll do it over cocktails.
Yeah, exactly. I think we're just about out of time, but I wanted to open it up if anyone had any other questions to kind of just open up to the floor too. If anyone had something about the foundation, wanted to talk to Nick about anything else on the top of their mind.
Do you think people are getting better or worse at thinking long term?
Like, if I had to give the entire world a score,
Yeah,
did
currently.
the score go up? I don't. This is one of the problem with long-term projects is assessing your efficacy. Out in 100 years, it's kind of difficult. It's hard to scope that. I think there's a lot of ways in which, again, human beings are just. We need short-term thinking, and people need to attune themselves to things on short time scales too. I think we're getting better at long-term thinking in the sense that we've, at least long now, just take what happens here, have spent over a quarter century applying ourselves to these questions, having these kinds of conversations in the context of the bar or the events, or just traveling around the world. So I think like the net amount of information we know about how to think long-term has absolutely increased. Whether that's evenly distributed across the entire world, I doubt that's the case. I think having an organization that's producing podcasts, newsletters, blog posts, talks, and putting it out there for free for people is one way that we're probably touching a lot of people that we're not even going to hear about. It's the other cool thing about it. If you work on long time scales, people show up into your life way later with a really cool story that started with something you did and you had no idea that was a story that was getting started on those days. So there's all these people that I think I'll probably meet in the next quarter century who are being touched by the work of the Long Now Foundation in really interesting ways. And then I'll have probably some better anecdotes for you. But I think on the whole, the answer is we're definitely learning more about it. Now the mission is to kind of how do we spread it out a little bit more and make sure that more people have access to this.
It's just a curiosity you can answer from your personal perspective instead of just for the whole foundation or something. But here we are in San Francisco, like a place obviously known for software startups. And the way that we experience like software online is so like interface dependent. And so something we touched on was like, we spoke earlier was like software can feel so ephemeral and you start something and then you build it and then it could like just be taken off. So I'm just curious what it's like to be like doing these long-term physical projects in like where you're based in San Francisco and so many things around you are software oriented and like, I don't know, potentially ephemeral. I'm just curious your take on that and if there's any way to preserve software in a way. I'm just curious.
Yeah, we're living in something of a digital dark age, right? Where most of our records are a lot more ephemeral than archivists would like them to be, for sure. One of our first events that we threw as the Long Now Foundation back in the late 90s was the Time and Bits conference, which was attacking exactly this problem. How do we understand this new world that we're in, the digital world, and how that affects the breadcrumb record trail that we're leaving of civilization through time. It's usually not good answers, because there's also the superabundance of things that we're also creating, right? Like, when the printing press came out, yeah, there was a lot more books, but the internet's done, way more than that. It's not linear. So I think personally, what I think becomes more important in a abundant information ecosystem is curation and collection. Like and this is a creative technology is like, how do you sculpt the set of things that people pay attention to and then argue for them to pay attention to this? Curation becomes really important for us. If you look at these shelves here, we've estimated we can fit about 3,000 books on these shelves. And this is one of our projects called the Manual for Civilization. And the idea is, if you had to jumpstart civilization, what would you like to have? It's kind of a variation of the desert island book question. And so you've got everything up there from mechanics, how to make steel, how to get penicillin, all the way to the cultural canon, Socrates, Shakespeare, that kind of stuff, and some hard science fiction, some futurism, and everything in between. So this is kind of a curatorial challenge, right? We still have empty shelves. So if you've got suggestions, I want to hear them. We should put them on the shelf. At some point, it's going to be at capacity, and then you have the one-in, one-out kind of phenomenon. And that's, I think, where things get spicy, because now all of a sudden, if you add a book, you have to kick somebody else's book out. And that's a good conversation for us to get into as a group, because I think curation done by individuals is interesting, but also, can you imagine curation of 3,000 volumes by the X thousand number of Long Now members. Like, that's kind of a really cool thing that I'd want to personally know what that collection of humans thinks we should be preserving for long periods of time. Obviously, they're not preserved in their digital form here, but we are working to scan these into a digital form with folks at the Internet Archive. And the Internet Archive folks, if you haven't looked at, I think most people here are probably familiar with the Internet Archive. Brewster and that whole team are like old, dear friends of ours. But they're doing some really amazing work on long-term archival stuff in the digital space. That is definitely worth checking out. There's also, like, in the space of long-term thinking, there's the things that you want to do, and there's the things that you want to see done. And I feel like this is in the category of Brewster. You should totally do all these really cool things. And he's really stoked to do them, so we're stoked to help.
That's amazing. And my 2 cents, just because I have a microphone too. Like that flow between like what is that conversation of like what is physical and what is software, what is hardware, is like a really like infinitely deep conversation too. That and it's almost like we're feeling like that line is blurring more and more now than it ever has. But maybe it was always blurred. Like maybe we're all software. Like maybe like this whole conversation too, right? Like, and so that's I think a very deep like philosophical thing that informs like the things we traditionally think about in both ways too. And so some of those conversations around like what does steelwork look like, and how, like what of those like abstract principles should we apply to what we call software today is really interesting. And as we're thinking about things lasting longer, like the concept of wear and longevity and patina and things like that, applying to like things that are ephemeral but maybe we like aspire to being more lasting, is like really healthy. And then similarly, like on the sustainability side too, like we think a lot about end of life now, and like how elegant is a thing that exists in the physical world, and how does it go back into like a circular life and degrade in an elegant way too. I think can be informed a lot from the software and ephemeral world as well too. So I love places geographically like San Francisco, but those conversations are happening all over the world. I think with groups of people like thinking about the kind of interface between those ideas, and so that's just like an extremely rich, exciting, deep conversation. Super into it.
My question, I think right now it's a very unusual time in the history, because every day we saw the pandemic, it's a wartime, it's climate change, and it's Roe versus Wade overturn, and there's just so much going on right now. So there are a lot of people who are very anxious. They're anxious about the future. So my question is, are you anxious? If yes, then what are you worried about, and how would you overcome your anxiety? If not, then what things you learned through coping through the whole civilization history make you less anxious, and maybe something you can share with us?
That's a great question. I am super anxious about the future, because being anxious about the future is what it feels like to be in the present, and it always has been. People have always been anxious about the future, and that's just how it seems to be. You can read stories going back thousands of years of people who felt like they were on an existential cliff, and a lot of them were on an existential cliff. So part of being alive is being, I think, attuned to the fact that our aliveness is somewhat fragile, that this isn't like a kind of thing we can just trust is going to happen on its own. There's a certain sense in which we want to lean forward and do what we can to preserve the parts of civilization that we do like. It's a curatorial question, right? What are the things that we want to take forward in the future? What are the things that we're happy to leave in the past? But the anxiety for me is abated by the fact that, like, oh, we're all anxious. We've all been anxious across thousands of years. Like, that's a kind of anxiety I can handle a little bit differently. You know what I mean? Have you ever been anxious and then you told someone you're anxious and they're like, I'm anxious about the exact same thing. And then you're like, oh, I feel better about it. Now that times like 108 billion people, and then I'm kind of okay with it. So yeah, totally anxious about the future, just like everybody's always been.
So my question is, we do have a couple thousand years where we could look back. So I'm curious about, when you're thinking about the next 10,000 years, what's your perspective about the patterns that you could look back versus that you think things might be completely different? There's not even a pattern we can reference to in terms of the future. How do you reference both dimension and find, a balanced kind of approach? Like the things that are changing and the things that are different? Yeah. Yeah. A lot of people say, well, we should be a good student of history, right? History will repeat. So those are the patterns that I was referring to. So I'm just curious about your perspective.
Yeah, you can think of something like Star Wars, right? Star Wars, it's in the future for sure. It's definitely not the present.
It was a long time ago.
Was it a long time ago? It's a galaxy.
In a galaxy far, far, far away.
But far, far away is just a distal measure. It's also far, far away in the past, really?
A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Oh. Whoa. Hold on, I need to take this in.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I think my argument still holds.
This is a good day for the
My
conversation.
argument still holds, which is that fundamentally Star Wars is a Western, right? Only instead of 6 shooters, you've got laser blasters. And so there's patterns there where you have these like good guys and bad guys, the light side of the force, the dark side of the force, the sheriffs and the outlaws. And fundamentally, there's the human thing happening that we can connect with. We can connect with in every period of peace. Doesn't even matter if it's even real, like something like Game of Thrones, which is in this like alternative period, we can relate to some of the drama and action there, some of the pathos that's happening to the characters. And so I think those patterns, the human thing is the stuff that I'm most interested in because it seems to not change. Like if someone points a laser blaster at me, I'm gonna have some feelings. Even though I've never had a laser blaster pointed at me, I know that I'm gonna have some feelings about something like that. And so there's those things that don't change. The things that do change get really interesting because again, the question for me is always, what do I want to be actively involved in changing? Because I can't change everything, right? But I have things in my life that I'm like, this needs to be different tomorrow than it was yesterday for certain reasons. Like in a certain sense, the way I think about this is often, how do I create the things that I really wish I would have had access to at a different time in my life? How do I become the person that I didn't run into, but really would have loved running into when I was working on X, Y, and Z thing? So for me, my personal answer is involved with the Long Now Foundation in the next 10,000 years. Yours might be totally different, but I think really attuning yourself to what is that thing that you want to be actively involved in changing in the future. That's about the limit of, I think, my concern about that boundary between things that change and don't. The things that don't change, I don't need to worry about because they're just not going to change. And then the things that do change, there's like a sliver of them that are like uniquely mine to like work on. At least I feel that way. And then I just focus on those.
So it's interesting to tune into this topic of curation and thinking about how to kind of best preserve a selection of all the information that we have. But the kind of natural tension that comes to mind is also preserving diversity of perspective and how that may come at the risk of curation. I'm just sort of curious if there's anything that the Long Now has researched or discovered, or maybe you personally, around how to kind of balance some of that tension between curation and the multifaceted nature of history and data.
Yeah, that's a great question because that is a really important issue, right? Is how do you curate in such a way that it's inclusive and it's grabbing all these other perspectives, putting them next to each other in really interesting ways that we can all benefit from for long time periods. And I think of that as kind of the preservational challenge. So like we do have the curatorial stuff that we work on to kind of hone those skills and think about things there, but there's also the preservational stuff like the language projects, right? Or you can even think about the genomic technology for conservation projects in Revive and Restore. Like these are fundamentally saying, like how do we make sure that these worldviews that are encapsulated in something like a language aren't lost when that basically it's usually because like grandkids aren't speaking the language anymore and so it just kind of dies out, but you can preserve that. And some people have actually brought back languages, and of course the de-extinction project is trying to bring back certain animals and that had an ecological function that was left undone. And so I think there's like an ethical pull towards preservation to the extent that you can. This becomes hard to your question about the digital space. It's hard to do that in a digital space, but there's the preservational challenge, and then the curatorial challenge is unique to each of us, and we learn from our lives are kind of carved out of time in a certain sense. Like the experiences you've had are going to be different from the experiences that I've had, and we benefit from preserving those and then sharing those with each other. And we know that. That's just kind of now that on a much longer time scale, right? How do we do that? And so libraries, collections, having talks. At this point, we've now had about, I think, almost 300 Long Now seminars about long-term thinking, where we've had people from all kinds of backgrounds, disciplines, geographies come and talk about their work in the Long Now context, and then put that out there in the world for free for people to have access to. I think that's really important. It's like getting all of the perspectives and then finding a way to preserve them for the future. That's its own kind of curatorial challenge.
All right, you're doing it.
This is such a cool conversation to listen into. The question I had was around like institutional resilience, and I'm curious, like, how does someone think about like I don't even know. Yeah, designing an institution or building an institution that can like last over like thousands of years. I was just talking to someone this morning about how like they work on a brand that has existed for 50 years, and I was like, that's wild, but like 10,000 years, how does that work? Or how are you like thinking about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. I think there's a couple ways to go about it. One is to take the whole 10,000-year frame in mind and say, okay, we are going to go from A to B. How do we get there strategically, right? And there's all kinds of stuff that we're hopefully going to be learning through this organizational continuity project. So gathering information from people who have had businesses that were operating in the Ottoman Empire and they're still operating in Massachusetts now. And like zillion symbols, by the way, like started in the Ottoman Empire, still functioning here. But like you have these organizations that have knowledge for how to get strategically from A to B across time. And then you have this idea of just hewing to a North Star. That's just the important thing. Like doing quality work's really important for anything lasting. And you can kind of lean into a certain intuition for like, what does that mean in the context of the work that you're doing? But it turns out like things like concepts like quality or authenticity or sincerity end up being these like nice little North Stars you can use on a day-to-day basis. So, you know, on Monday or what is it, Wednesday, Thursday, you can kind of think about like, how do I organize my time and my resources to be of service to making something last? But then there are things like, you know, there's different ways of structuring your org design. There's organizations that have lasted because there's been lots of chapters of them all over the place. And then some organizations have been eaten up by that kind of a strategy. Then you've got organizations that have been in one place, and that's how they've lasted. But then you've got organizations that have been eaten up by that strategy. And so there's a bunch of different ways to go about it. Actually figuring out where that line is, where we can learn some things from history is, I think, like the main driving force of that organizational continuity project. We know there's a lot to be learned, and we just want to get started on gathering it and parsing it out.
Thanks so much, Nick. I really
Thank you
appreciate
so much.
it.
Really appreciate it. This is really good. Thank you.